Michael Binion to talk about carbon capture. And he is, of course, with the Modern Miracle Network. Michael, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you very much for having me, and Troy for introducing that we're a sponsor. Of course, when you're a sponsor, you get to speak on these panels, and I get to be on with such a great group of people for doing that. What Modern Miracle Network, we were formed to to create a reasoned discussion about hydrocarbons in Canada. And what I really want to talk about today is the idea to reframe the energy transition issue from where we are now, which is, I think, a place that, you just can't get there from here. You have to choose between human progress and the environment, the way the current problem has been framed. And I'd like to reframe this energy transition issue as a problem that we actually can solve. And so really what I'm thinking about is the idea of that we rethink transition as not a transitioning off of hydrocarbons, but an actual transition of our energy diet and a transition of hydrocarbons to an energy choice that I think with existing technology, and I'll talk about this briefly, with existing technology can already be a fully sustainable fuel and with zero emissions. And I think that's the part that a lot of people are not really understanding, is how far that technology has come. And so part of this is then to realize that the discussion we've been having around climate models, are they accurate, are they not accurate, are the Paris goals the right ones or the wrong ones, has really taken us away from what I think is the real problem. And the real problem, I think, is that we have very likely projections that will have 30% more people. So think about 7.5 billion people to something like 10 billion people by 2050, but a more than doubling of GDP. Now, this, of course, assumes we don't completely screw up this whole discussion of energy transition, but if we can get it right, then we should have a more than doubling of GDP, 30% more people. This is a dramatic change in economic activity and people on the earth. And so the issue there, and Joe Oliver talks about this, I think, quite well when he talks about extreme weather. Let's say weather doesn't change at all between now and 2050. In the next 30 years, it turns out the climate models were all wrong. The weather's not changing at all. Extreme weather is exactly the same. But if we have double the GDP and 30% more people living in coastal areas or in forests or in vulnerable areas, extreme weather will still be a bigger problem. It's baked in. So if we think about that we have a problem of more people and more GDP, then we have an environmental problem to deal with, even if the climate models are wrong. Or as one environmentalist, Ngo, put it to me, oh, look at this, it's 2050. It turns out the climate models were wrong. Oh, darn, we saved the world for nothing. So if we reframe this as an issue of population and growth and economy, how do we maintain human progress? And how do we continue to improve the environment? Then I think there's a problem that we can solve. And I also think if we don't come up with private market-based solutions for that problem of population growth and bigger environmental problems, then people will go along with the big global government solutions that are on offer because it's the only solution on offer. And I don't think we're going to convince people that population growth and GDP growth is not an issue, because I think it is an issue. So I want to just talk a little bit about how I changed my mind on this. And it's a story, a Dutch filmmaker, was really quite interesting, called me from Los Angeles, California. He said, I want you to be in my documentary. And I went, oh, it's about time, right? So, of course, I agreed to the meeting right away. And he came to my office. Well, it was quite clear within about the first 60 seconds the film wasn't actually about me. So that was a bit of disappointment for me. But what it was about was Suzanne West from Imagineer. And she had this idea that you could produce hydrocarbons, oil and gas, with zero emissions, which I said, well, that's ridiculous. We all know that's not possible. And so, he wanted me be in the film to be the person that was as I felt every good story needs a hero and a villain. It seemed clear that he was casting me as the villain, and I was going to be the one who said this wasn't possible. But I started to look into it. And what I realized was that it actually is possible if you can get zero emissions energy. And we actually made a project in Quebec where we have access to hydro in my for-profit life at Quest Energy for zero emissions production of natural gas. And we've engineered that all with, to my surprise, existing technologies. I've now started to move into the idea, well, if we can produce it without emissions, why can't we consume it without emissions? And that's been the new journey that we're on right now. And I want to just give a bit of a shout out to Ngos, who I fight with all the time. So don't think that these people are all necessarily my best friends. But I want to give them the shout out. If they hadn't have pushed on these issues, I never would have thought about this. I never would have thought about, can we do zero emissions production or zero emissions consumption? And what I've discovered is I think it is possible with existing technology. And so I think the solution to the problem that I framed at the beginning is what I'm calling this and I'm not calling it. This is an emerging thing that you can find on the internet, the circular economy. What I've coined is the 3 R's of a full circular economy, which is that we reduce and we recycle or we return emissions under the ground. And the technologies are out there. I just did the panel that Danielle said. We've had people, we have somebody on the panel right here who's talking about making hydrogen and creating industrial quality CO2 from it. You'll hear from her shortly after me. But you can already today make out of carbon dioxide, ethanol, methanol, propanol, calcium carbonate, magnesium carbonate, fertilizer, ethylene, concrete, cement, carbon nanotubes, hand sanitizer, and my personal favorite, vodka. The vodka, by the way, if we get this all screwed up on the energy transition, we're going to need that. So we're glad to know we can do it without emissions. The other thing just to point out is Mother Nature does a great job of recycling carbon, and Mother Nature already recycles carbon into all of those products, but a lot of other interesting things like people and living and life. I mean, this is a natural cycle. What we're really talking about is accelerating that cycle and people doing it ourselves as opposed to waiting for Mother Nature. So just in conclusion, I'm thinking if we can reframe this problem as population, GDP, environmental impacts, and that it's about maintaining human progress while we reduce those impacts in spite of a growing population, then we have a solvable problem with innovation. And we can maintain human progress and we can maintain environmental progress, and we just need market solutions, not big government to get us there. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Michael. Let me just ask one question before I move on to hydrogen, because I know in that panel discussion, you kind of teased out, what does the price of carbon need to be to make these technologies marketable, worthwhile? And I think you've got a pretty good answer to that, because I think we are all looking at carbon dioxide or carbon pricing going up to $170 per ton and kind of freaking out about that. Does it need to be higher than that? Is the break even lower than that? What'd you discover?
Yeah, so the people that we had on the panel, and I've probably met with about 15 different people with different technologies, with 5 on that panel. One of them says, we're right there today, we don't need any carbon credits. And I think it's going to be like everything, it's going to be a curve. You know, the higher the carbon credit, and I think we do need to look at providing market incentives to some of these technologies, but the higher the carbon credit, the more the technologies become commercial. I think the cutoff is between 0, where some of these technologies think they're commercial. Already today, we can produce concrete from CO2, and we can do it with 0 carbon credits. That's the one end, 0. The other end, I think, is the cost of capture and storage. Because if people say, well, I need $500 a ton to make vodka, for example, well, people might say, well, I think I'd rather pay what's already less than $100 to capture it and store it. So I think we've got and the people on their panel, they were all targeting to make their technologies commercial at $100 or less. That was a common target. So somewhere between 0 and 100 seems to be the number, and some of them are already there today.
All right, one more question before I leave to go on to some of the other technologies. Someone's asking what the chemistry is to burn natural gas without emissions. Is that something that Catherine will get into, or are you able to comment on that, Michael?
Yeah, so that's what I'm talking about. Let's go back to the reduce, recycle, and return. So if we decide to use the natural gas as just a pure fuel, just like we do right now, then I'm saying, okay, well, let's reduce, like my company is, we'll produce the natural gas with 0 emissions, so there's less emissions to start with before you even get it. Then as you burn it, you'll create the CO2. But if we can capture that CO2, for example, in an industrial quality CO2, like Catherine's about to talk about, it can feed into it can now be recycled into concrete, nanotubes, or vodka, if you want to go with my personal favorite. And then any CO2, you say, hey, you know what, we just can't recycle all of it because it's not economic to do it yet. Great, well then we'll take that and we'll put it back. That's the return part. So reduce, recycle, return 100% of the emissions means that we're now real 0. We're not using carbon offsets. We're just capturing. We're just taking a full circular economy approach to this. That those emissions, to the extent they don't get reduced or recycled, end up returned under the ground. My best argument to this is that being right is highly overrated. And I think and I get it. Here's the debate is what's the right number? Is 500? Is the right number is 400 parts per million? But my whole point there is I think the average person doesn't even know what a part per million is. So you're trying to have a debate with the public about parts per million when they don't even know what it is, and you want to prove, well, I'm right. That your 500 is too low or your 500 is too high, and I think it kind of misses the point. But I also will say, let's just take that argument to its illogical conclusion. At 2,000 parts per million, CO2 starts to impact health. I mean, so CO2 is completely non-toxic, like water is non-toxic, but too much of it starts to hurt you. So at some point in that argument, you still have to say, okay, well, 500 parts is wrong, but at some point, hopefully we can all agree 2,000 parts is wrong. It starts to affect human health. And at what point in time, if it's not 2050 or 2100, it's 2200, we reach 2,000 parts per million. We've got to do something eventually, right? So I would say, take that argument to its illogical conclusion. But the main point being right is overrated is that we create a binary argument: do something, do nothing. And the people who are for do something have got authoritarian solutions, like the people with authoritarian longings. I think the consequences of losing the debate, even though let's say we're right at what 500 was the wrong number. The consequences of losing is we end up with an authoritarian thing. And guess what? Then we'll need the vodka because we won't double the GDP. We'll end up with a lot of trouble. We'll end up with a lot bigger problems, right? And so I would say, I think we have to come with market-based solutions. And the other final thing I would say is, I'm not just talking about CO2. We're talking about the overall environmental impact of 10 billion people with double the GDP. There's going to be more NOx. There's going to be more SOx. There's going to be more land impacts. There's going to be more impacts of all kinds. And if we don't come up with solutions that say, how do we produce the extra energy we need and everything else we need, plastic bottles, everything. How do we produce everything else that we're going to need with double the GDP with a lower environmental impact? So the people who come back and say, well, the emissions aren't important. Okay, but what about all the other environmental impacts? Let's talk about that too. And the final thing I would say is the risk of losing the debate is the cost is too high. We have to come up with a private market solution. And I think we just have to say, listen, every society can make up its own mind if it wants to invest in carbon capture or not invest in carbon capture. But as a producer of oil and gas, I want to be able to say to people, I'm willing to take responsibility for the impacts of my product. I think the example I've used for you, like General Motors doesn't sell you a car and then say good luck with that, right? So I think the oil and gas industry has to stop saying, we're selling you this oil and gas, good luck with that. I hope you're right, it's not hurting the planet.
I think looking at the opportunity cost of not doing something, like Michael kind of said, freaks me out, right?
Danielle, can I just interject there? This argument that Canada is too small to make a difference, I just fundamentally object to the very premise that Canada is too small to make a difference on anything. I really dislike that argument because I think it's just the opposite. I think Canada is one of the largest producers of primary products in the world, which the world is going to need more and more and more as we grow in GDP and population. And I think we fundamentally are in a position strategically to make a huge difference. And I'll just throw, we produce the lowest emissions LNG in the world. If we just replaced LNG from other countries with our LNG, forget coal, we'd make a big difference because we have the lowest LNG in the world. But let's think about the difference we could make if we could reduce the 30% of the world's emissions in China with Canadian lowest in the world LNG. And by the way, we have some of the lowest emissions lentils in the world. Who knew that? It comes from Saskatchewan. We have the world's lowest emissions aluminum in the world. Canada can make an enormous difference, but I do think that we need to get away from this binary debate where some people are saying, Canada, reduce your emissions at all costs. Let's actually actively go and say, no, Canada is big in the world. We can make a big difference in the world, and we're going to do it, and we're going to do it by exporting more of what we're the world's best at. And part of that's going to be that we have the world's best consumption technologies for oil and gas. Nobody in the world's producing oil and gas more responsibly. And by the way, we're also going to make sure that you as our consumer can consume it more responsibly too. The point I want to make that applies to every speaker here is that a lot of the argument for renewables is okay, wind and solar isn't fully economic yet, and wind and solar hasn't solved all the technical challenges yet. But look how fast the technology is changing. We're soon going to have a battery breakthrough. We're soon going to have look how fast the cost of solar. Look how fast the technology is changing. It's inevitable that it will be economic, even though it isn't today. Well, what's also true of nuclear and biofuels and hydrogen and oil and gas? Our technologies aren't static either. They're changing just as rapidly. I'd argue in oil and gas even more rapidly. So all of these energy solutions are all getting better. They're all getting more sustainable. And I think that's a good news story there, just the idea that technology is not static for anybody. And then the other thing I would say, I get there's some people saying, well, who cares if oil and gas is sustainable or not? Okay, great. I understand you don't care. But isn't it kind of cool that it could be? And that the technology is changing and that we could, with a reduce, recycle, and return circular economy approach, make oil and gas a fully sustainable part of our energy diet, which means that we could make it part of putting the right energy in its right place, which we're going to need because we're going to need all our energy choices for 10 billion people with double the GDP. And isn't it great that we have an opportunity to have a free market solution to that, as opposed to only having the option of do nothing or accept big government, global authoritarian solutions. So that's where I'll finish.
Michael, it's a great point to finish on.